The CB radio went silent at a point where it always hissed, and that perfect silence hit me like a warning that didn't come from a sign or siren, but from a hidden rule. I was driving down a state highway in rural Missouri, off the interstates, in the still colorless dawn. I was hauling a light freight job on paper, but expensive in terms of payment. Molded, palletized plastic parts, a short destination, vague instructions to stay en route and avoid detours, as if the problem was me looking to the side. The sender was a company with a generic name and an address that, when I put it into the GPS, pointed to a block of identical warehouses. The digital receipt had an illegible signature and a phone number that went straight to voicemail. Everything seemed normal enough to pass and strange enough not to argue. I leave the CB radio on because it occupies the cabin. Even when nobody's saying anything useful, the human hiss prevents me from hearing my own blood. That night, not even that. The radio light on, the volume halfway up, and a clean emptiness without any hint of flaw. Defects are usually dirty. A broken cable crackles when you turn the steering wheel. A loose antenna picks up interference near a power line. An oxidized connector makes intermittent noise. That silence was complete, continuous, as if someone had drawn a perimeter of muteness around me. I thought about stopping at a gas station and tinkering with the antenna, but the freight was paid for in a hurry, and I'd already learned that the kind of contract that pays for speed usually gets you paid elsewhere. I endured a few more miles and looked for an old dirt roadside rest area, one of those leftovers from the time when the state didn't invest in rest areas. I also wanted a place off camera, because it felt like the silence of the radio didn't want an audience. I pulled over just to adjust a strap and stretch my back. I pulled the brake, turned off the engine, and stood still long enough to feel the truck settle on the gravel, losing the last tremor, as if the world had pulled the plug on its movement. I mentally counted to 20 just to make sure it wasn't the engine vibration tricking my ears. The moment the cabin truly came to a complete standstill, the CB radio opened a clear transmission, without calls, without identification, without the usual radio ritual. A voice began to read a crime report as if reading a surrender document, without emotion, without haste. She described a robbery at a gas station a few miles away, mentioned the bomb that was outside the camera's frame, mentioned the side of the cash register where the lens was covered with tape, mentioned the dark sedan that would be waiting with its low beams on, and mentioned an exit onto a gravel side road. It was too much detail to be trucker talk. The kind of detail you don't invent without having seen it or without having planned to see it. I shifted gears reflexively, just a touch, and the transmission died mid-sentence, cut off the exact moment the vibration returned to the steering wheel. The radio went back to perfect silence as if its operating condition was my immobility. I got back on the road and drove for 15 minutes in complete silence. I slowed down almost to zero on a wide shoulder to test it, and nothing happened. Only when I came to a complete stop, pulled the brake and turned off the engine, letting the diesel stop shaking, did the voice return with a different reading. The rule was merciless. It wasn't enough to stop. It had to be completely still. If the engine idling, the transmission would fail. If I released the brake and the truck swayed even an inch, my voice would disappear. The radio only spoke when I turned into a statue. I repeated the test at more than one point, like someone hunting for a short distance on a wire, and noticed the second pattern. It wasn't everywhere. Lighted post, busy rest area, yard with cameras, nothing. Forgotten recess, side road entrance, deactivated rest area, always a voice. At one of them I saw, in the distance, an old "no parking" sign lying in the ditch, as if someone had tried to prohibit it and given up. The messages dealt with future crimes, with a narrow window of detail and cold precision. A rural warehouse break-in, a convenience store cash register robbery, a quick hijacking of a work truck. The timing, route, blind spot, even the burnt-out reflector and the loose fence on the right side. I didn't hear threats, I heard logistics. I began to feel that those descriptions had a rhythm, as if someone had trained their voice to suppress emotion, to keep the listener as a tool and not as a person. On the second day came the first confirmation that removed the doubt from my mind. A local website published a robbery report practically identical to what I had heard, including an error about the vehicle that was corrected hours later. The voice had mentioned the error before it even existed. as if even the confusion was part of the script. The correction was quick, almost as if someone were monitoring the reaction, adjusting the public narrative in the same way they adjusted the radio. From that point on, I stopped calling it a coincidence and started calling it a schedule. The voice didn't ask for a response because it didn't need verbal confirmation. It only needed a parked truck, because a parked truck is the kind of thing that becomes an automatic record. And I noticed a third pattern. The transmissions only came when I was stopped in places that had reasonable cell phone signal coverage, as if the radio was dependent on another network besides the air. I started observing the transmission points and noticed signs of repetition. Tires marked always in the same alignment, recent packaging, crushed bottles, bits of plastic pallet tape. It wasn't a natural stop. It was a spot used by people who stopped quickly, turned off the engine, and remained motionless long enough to listen. I started looking at the shoulder of the road like someone looking at a map, searching for where a traffic camera would have an angle, where a satellite would have a line of sight, where an app would indicate congestion even when there wasn't any. On the third day, at a disused rest area near Marshall, the voice shifted focus. It described a white truck with an enclosed trailer, parked facing a line of trees with its cargo listed as plastic, and cited the state of the license plate, which was mine. It was describing my vehicle without mentioning my name. The tree it mentioned existed. Its shadow was falling directly on the side of my trailer. The feeling of having been put on a report before I even realized it filled me with a dull rage, because it was a control freak who didn't ask permission. The broadcast didn't say I was going to be robbed. It said a robbery would happen nearby and that the presence of the truck would break the camera reading, create volume compatible with normal traffic, and reduce the risk of alerting anyone. I wasn't the target, I was part of the scenery, a large and innocent object in the frame. I saw for the first time my work being described as a variable in a crime, and that made me think about how many times I had already been part of the scenery without knowing it. I started the engine before it was at its limit, and the voice died in the same fraction of a second that the vibration returned to the steering wheel. I left there with my body warm and my head cool, because I had understood the reason for the immobility. Immobility is evidence, and evidence is what provides an alibi. I thought about calling the police, but I imagined the phrase coming out of my mouth and the look on the face of whoever hears it. A truck driver saying that the radio predicts crime. I knew that, without physical proof, I would change the story, not the scheme. A parked truck appears on traffic cameras, on satellites, in traffic counts, in traffic measurement apps. A moving truck becomes noise. If someone needed to prove that a place was normal before a crime, they needed parked vehicles as anchors, and they needed those anchors to be plausible. I started noticing parked police cars that didn't even look at me. A mobile scale near Sedalia released my bypass without me having an active transponder that day, as if someone had already decided I was a low-profile vehicle. I went through that with sweaty palms, understanding that the same hand that makes me invisible can make me a target whenever it wants. The scheme began to take shape, to distribute normalcy so that the crime appeared random, to scatter ordinary trucks in specific locations at the right time, creating silent witnesses who don't know they are witnesses. If someone asks later, the answer becomes common sense. There was a truck there, so nothing seemed suspicious. And each truck parked there became another layer of normalcy, a curtain thick enough for the crime to pass through without tearing. The following night, the CB brought a rough count for a robbery at a rural store less than 3 miles away. The voice treated the time as a delivery item, and I felt my stomach clench as if I were about to sign something with my name on it. I started the engine and drove off, and the radio died. I heard the beginning of a detail about clothing and gloves, and realized it wasn't just robbery, it was standardization, as if there were a manual. The next day, the news appeared, and in the text a detail that chilled me to the bone. Someone mentioned a large truck stopped near the curve before the accident. I had left in time to avoid being that truck, but I saw the machinery working with another driver occupying the place that would have been mine. The driver who took my place probably never knew he was being used. He just became a line of text in some traffic report. I started avoiding stops, refueling quickly, sleeping with the engine running in a well-lit parking lot to avoid absolute silence. It was expensive, dirty, and attracted attention, but it kept me from becoming the statue-like state that the CB, presumably referring to a radio station or similar device, demanded for speaking. I began to fear my own habit, fear of turning off the engine to save diesel, fear of becoming the kind of fixed point someone could use to justify something else. A week later, the app offered me another delivery with the same standard and a route passing through 2 of those points. I refused. On the first night after the refusal, I turned off the engine at a busy gas station, and the onboard computer, which I had already disconnected from the antenna, emitted a very short transmission, as if coming from inside the cabin, registering a white truck that did not meet the stop and mentioning my condition. That stop was not a metaphor, it was a coordinate. The voice treated my refusal as a process failure, and this showed me that I was already inside the system, even while trying to get out. That's when I understood that the radio wasn't just a receiver, it was a sensor, or it was connected to something that knew when and where I was stationary. I ripped the CB radio off the dashboard, removed the cables, took off the bracket, disposed of it far from any camera, and bought another one in another city so as not to raise suspicion. Even so, for weeks I saw weighbridges releasing bypasses as if my profile had been normalized, and I saw trucks parked in old parking bays like people waiting for permission to exist. The final rupture was simple and worse than any isolated crime. The crime was the infrastructure that fabricated the scenario, distributed alibis, and transformed ordinary drivers into statistics of normality. 3 weeks later, the app disappeared from my phone without me deleting it. I didn't know how many layers existed or who was in charge, only that it was big enough to delete an app from my phone. The trail was what remained. Even today, when I pull over and the world gets too clean, I don't test the rule. I start the engine and drive away, because in that system the only thing they really needed from me was my inaction. If you're enjoying the stories, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment. It really helps the channel. Let's get to the next story. My comment was still on my mind even though the post was no longer there. I had stopped to refuel one early morning in Iowa, and in the time it took to fill 2 tanks and clean the windshield, I opened an old trucker forum that I had followed for years. It wasn't a large social network, just a simple board, full of short topics, road reports, police checkpoint warnings, and arguments over cargo. I used an old nickname and never posted a photo or license plate. That night I read a post by a driver describing a crime in a travel plaza, something quick and dirty, with too many details to be made up. I replied with a practical recommendation, as if I knew where the blind spots were and how the back of the building deceives those arriving by truck. 2 days later, when I returned to the same topic, the page gave an error. The link opened and closed as if it had never existed. I searched by title, username, words from the account. Nothing. Not even browser cache. On another site I would find a shadow, a mirror, someone quoting. There was nothing there. It was as if someone had swept it off the map with a damp broom. This kind of disappearance wasn't impossible. Moderators delete things, authors regret it, forums crash. But my impulse was strange. I felt I needed to prove to myself that I hadn't made it up. The only proof I had was the memory of what I wrote, and the memory came with details I don't usually remember, like a cracked sign at the entrance and 2 old out-of-service pumps near the truck area, as well as a shower corridor that curved before reaching the doors. I kept driving because truckers don't have the luxury of investigating shadows. I took I-80 east, loaded with wrapping paper, and tried to forget about it. Even so, during short stops, I'd open the form again and scroll through the page like someone poking at a wound. Other topics were there, old discussions, photos of trucks, snow warnings, people complaining about weighbridges. Only that report had disappeared, and its absence felt heavier than a regular deleted topic. On the 3rd night, someone posted a warning about disappearing topics and suggested that no one leave too many details in the comments, because that becomes material for the wrong people. I read it and felt a cold discomfort because I had responded as if I were offering someone a map to escape the gaze of a trooper, describing the back of the building and the angle of the cameras as if I had measured them with my own eyes. That wasn't my style. I talk about safety, about avoiding confusion, about not putting yourself in a bad situation. Even so, the memory of my comment came back with an overly confident, almost technical tone, as if I were correcting someone who had described the place incorrectly. I found myself typing quickly, without proofreading, as if it were routine, and routine is what scares you most when you don't remember creating it. The next day, waiting to unload near Omaha, I opened the carrier's tracking app and pulled up my stop history with time, coordinates, and duration. My eye locked onto an address, the same travel plaza mentioned in the deleted post. I had stopped there. Not just stopped. I had stayed for 2 hours and 50-something minutes, on the same night the crime allegedly occurred, and the timeline was too clean, as if I had completed a perfect break. I remembered the light rain in Iowa, the smell of diesel in Nebraska, a bad coffee at some random gas station. From that specific stop, I had a blank space, like a torn-out page. No scene of parking, no scene of getting in, no scene of getting out. What I had were numbers, and numbers don't console. They accuse. I stared at that record until the screen went dark from inactivity. I tried to blame it on fatigue. I'd driven too many hours before, and the brain erases parts of it. But my ELD, engineer load device, registered that period as off-duty, meaning I was supposedly resting, not behind the wheel, not moving. Rest usually leaves a memory, even if it's just of a bad mattress and the noise of the compressor. That pothole didn't fit with rest. It fit with a choice I didn't remember making. I searched the glove compartment for receipts, those thermal tapes that fade quickly. I found a shower voucher from that travel plaza with a printed code and the correct date. I found a receipt for water, dried meat, and a pack of wet wipes. I was there. I bought things. I used services. I existed in that place for almost 3 hours, and I didn't remember any of it. Not the smell of the bathroom, not the sound of the door, not the face of the person who handed me the voucher. I checked the fuel card and saw a record of a fuel fill-up that was far too small for that point in the route, as if I had only put in enough to continue and, at the same time, leave a record. The kind of fill-up you do when you don't want to raise suspicion of a full tank, but want to prove you passed through there. This gave me a chill that wasn't mystical at all. It was administrative and suspicious, the kind that ends up in a report. I started retracing the route minute by minute with what I had: ELD, coupon, toll, credit card statement. Before that stop, I was coming from a short layover. Then, I appeared at a toll booth 80 miles in, with a time that was far too precise for someone who had left rested. I had driven as if I were in a hurry, for no reason I could remember, and the average speed matched as if I had followed a plan, not an impulse. In my mind, the forum post grew and gained the weight of evidence. I remembered the author saying that the crime occurred near the shower corridor, out of view of the main cameras, where the building curves and the reflection in the glass deceives those looking from afar. I remembered my comment mentioning the service door behind the ice machine and the rear camera pointed at the trash can. I couldn't have known this without having observed. And, if I did observe, I was closer to the crime than I wanted to admit. I started looking for other signs of myself that night. On my phone bill, there was a call of less than a minute to a local number, unsaved. There was no message, no call history, nothing in the phone's memory, just the cold record that I had dialed. I didn't remember making that call, and I didn't remember receiving a call back. It was as if I had rung a doorbell and left before hearing it. Paranoia made me look at my own truck as if I were a stranger. I examined the cab under the seat, behind the dashboard, inside the tool compartment. Nothing screamed out, but I found a pair of crumpled, used disposable gloves in the trash. Things I only use when handling oil or doing heavy cleaning. The first aid kit had been opened and repackaged with a different knot, and I couldn't swear it was me. There was a small scratch on my wrist that I didn't remember making. I slept badly and woke up worse. On the road, any light in the rear-view mirror seemed like a chase. Any pickup truck that maintained the same speed for too long seemed like someone was sizing me up. I didn't want to involve the police because I had no facts, just a blank memory and a receipt. A blank memory is the kind of thing that puts you on the wrong list, especially if you've already left a public comment that sounds like advice from someone who knows too much. A week later, the forum completely crashed. The domain simply stopped responding, as if it had been unplugged. I found people commenting elsewhere about deleted reports and disappearing threads, and I noticed an ugly pattern. The disappearing threads always involved specific events, always with camera details, always with a time. Some said it was drama. Others said it was people cleaning up evidence. For me, the difference no longer mattered. In a parking lot in northern Indiana, a private security guard checked my documents far too carefully. He checked my name, my dot number, compared my license plate to a printed list, and lingered a second longer on the ELD. He handed it back expressionlessly and moved on to the next truck. That delay was the first outward sign that my name was circulating among hands that were anything but curious. That night, I used the poor Wi-Fi in the courtyard to look for local news about crimes in that travel plaza. I found a short note about ongoing investigations, no details, no photos, no interviews. The date matched. The location matched. The lack of details was what scared me the most, because a lack of details usually means that someone is putting the pieces together and hasn't yet chosen which piece to burn. I tried to convince myself that I only saw something and my mind went blank so I could keep working. But the comment I remembered wasn't from a witness. It was from someone giving guidance. I remembered pointing out the way to a door in the direction of a camera as if it were common knowledge. And common knowledge in this case is only common to those who have already needed it. The memory hole began to fill with disordered fragments. Wet floor reflecting amber light. A metal door with a thick handle. The smell of cheap disinfectant mixed with old frying oil. A hand pushing ice aside. A click of a lock. I didn't see faces, I didn't hear words, but I felt the space with the certainty of someone who had been there and wanted to leave quickly. I made the mistake of going back there, off my planned route, with an empty truck and some excuse. I parked in the same area as the trucks and saw the two old pumps out of service, exactly as in the post. I walked to the shower corridor and found the service door behind the ice machine. In the corner, the small camera was pointing at the trash can, not the corridor. I had described it as if describing my own kitchen. On my way out, I saw a makeshift memorial in a corner of the parking lot, old flowers and a faded ribbon attached to a plaque. No name, just the gesture of someone who still remembers. I returned to the booth with a certainty I had been avoiding. I hadn't just passed through. I had been a part of it, even if it was just by standing in the right spot, blocking the view of a corridor, or opening a door when someone needed 15 seconds without a camera. Deep in my glove compartment, among old manuals and maps, I found a crumpled internal access ticket, stamped at that travel plaza, with a code that wasn't a customer code. It was something for an employee, maintenance, a service area. I should never have had that. And I had no idea how it got there, which meant the best explanation was the one I feared most. That same week, an automated notification from the shipping company asked me to keep my records intact for 90 days, at the request of a state authority. No names, no charges, just the dry request. I stared at the screen until it hurt, because 90 days is the length of an investigation that's still deciding who will bear the brunt of the blame, and I already knew which part of me they would choose if they needed a name. I haven't written in any forums anymore. If I can guide someone about blind spots and service doors without remembering, I can do worse in the same silence. I keep driving and hoping that my memory stays broken, because if it comes back whole, it won't bring relief. It will bring certainty. The first time I saw the name of that route was on a truckers' forum where nobody seemed willing to explain anything. A thread would pop up, gather half a dozen truncated answers, and within a few hours, all the content would disappear. The post was still online, but empty, as if someone had just wiped the text clean. It wasn't a famous road, nor a high-risk corridor marked on the map. It was a little-used logistical detour, connecting two secondary points off the main axis. No border, no significant toll, nothing to justify the collective silence. Even so, the subject always died down quickly, and nobody commented twice. I ignored it for weeks. Forums are full of exaggeration, and every driver has seen a legend spring up out of nowhere. The problem started when a freight job appeared with an above-average price, a comfortable window, and a strange note in the instructions, preferred route defined by the client. The route passed exactly through the stretch that nobody wanted to record. The shipment was too ordinary to justify paranoia, Equipment packed in industrial boxes, regular seal, weight within the standard, clean origin, destination a regional distribution center I had already served. The kind of freight that doesn't usually come with a story or a note. I accepted without mentioning the route to anyone. Not in the group, not on the forum, not in any gas station conversations. Part of me wanted to see if the silence was just superstition. Another part had already understood that talking too much was the quickest way to become the topic of conversation. I entered the detour at the beginning of the night. The signage was minimal but adequate. Good asphalt, recent paint, signs too new for such a little-used stretch. There was no gas station, no rest area, not even accumulated trash on the shoulder. It was a clean road in a way that doesn't match neglect. For the first few kilometers, everything seemed normal. The radio worked, the cell phone signal fluctuated as usual, and the truck responded well. But not a single vehicle appeared coming from the opposite direction. Not a light truck, not a utility vehicle, not a stray car. The traffic was zero, as if I had entered a restricted stretch of road. The silence there wasn't a lack of sound. It was a lack of reference points. The engine seemed too loud, the wind non-existent, and I unconsciously turned down the radio as if that road demanded discretion. The feeling was of crossing a place that didn't want witnesses, even when there was no one around. The navigation app remained active, but the estimated time started behaving erratically. It neither increased nor decreased. It stayed fixed, as if I were standing still, even as miles passed. I drove for almost 20 minutes without seeing the calculation change for a single second. The first sign, which wasn't on the map, didn't indicate a city or an exit. It was a generic warning about reduced speed and a short recommendation: keep flowing. That didn't make sense because there was no traffic at all, but the message was there as a rule. I wanted to send a comment in the driver's group, something neutral, just to test it. The message didn't fail. It simply wasn't sent. No error message appeared, there was no notification. The text disappeared from the screen as if I had never typed it. It wasn't a visible block, it was an annulment. I understood that mechanics wasn't blatant censorship. It was communicative futility. Everything I tried to record there would cease to exist before it even became a record. The collective silence wasn't a pact, it was a function of the environment. A few kilometers later, I saw the first truck stopped on the shoulder. Engine off, lights off, door closed intact. There was no triangle, no hazard lights, no sign of an accident. It was simply there, as if it had been parked and abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I drove past without slowing down too much. The dashboard indicated a momentary drop in the tracker signal, but it quickly stabilized. Even so, I felt that the truck hadn't stopped by choice. It had been removed from the flow of traffic, like an item that had been taken out of inventory. Others came. One every few minutes, always on the shoulder, always dark, always with no driver in sight. I started looking at the ground beside them, searching for recent tire tracks, footprints, anything. There were none. It was as if they had been placed there without any friction. The app then displayed a short message, unlike any standard warning. You are within the operational route. Maintain your course. There was no confirmation button, no option to refuse, and no support field. It was an order, not a warning. From that point on, the cargo ceased to be irrelevant, not because of its contents, but because of its purpose. I wasn't just transporting boxes. I was filling a time slot that needed to be occupied so that other movements could pass behind my trail. Slowing down too much, stopping, leaving the designated lane, everything seemed to break an unwritten rule, and whoever broke it ceased to be part of it. The trucks on the shoulder were silent proof of this because someone had decided they shouldn't be on the road anymore. I felt the urge to call the carrier and ask for route confirmation. The phone dialed, rang, and the call dropped without a message. I tried again, on another number, and the same thing happened. It wasn't a common lack of signal. It was a selective failure. I was being left alone on purpose. Further ahead, an unmarked gantry crossed the road. No cameras in sight, no toll sign. Even so, my tracker blinked and the dashboard registered an automatic event, as if I had passed through a private checkpoint. The feeling of being on someone's property became solid. The distribution center appeared suddenly, without any sign announcing its arrival. An open gate, sufficient light, subdued activity. The employees asked nothing beyond the dock number indicated on my app. No one commented on the route. No one asked casual questions. Everything was mechanical, fast, impersonal. The unloading was silent and efficient. I stayed in the cabin, listening to the trailer vibrate with the internal movement, and felt the weight subtly shift, as if some of what was coming out wasn't exactly what had gone in. There was no visible change, just the certainty that at some point the contents had changed. When I finished the delivery, the app marked everything as normal. Consistent times, no alerts, automatic electronic signature. The problem was in the history. That part of the route simply didn't appear in the detailed record. It was as if the system had skipped that part to protect the timeline. I left there and returned to the main road. The world regained its noise. Traffic, radio, notifications, wind hitting the car body. Everything was working again, as if I had crossed an area where communication had no value. Normality even seemed aggressive after the silence. At a busy gas station, I recognized a familiar driver and almost commented on the detour, as if sharing an odd detail from a trip. I stopped mid-impulse. Not out of childish fear, but out of understanding. To speak would be to try to disrupt a mechanism that had already used my trail. The next morning, I searched the forums. The thread was there, empty, as always. No new comments, no old ones, no trace. I searched the cache, the history, the captures. Nothing. It was as if the entire internet had learned to forget that name. The next freight job I was offered had a different origin, a common destination, and the same note. Preferred route defined by the client. I understood the part that nobody writes. Whoever passes through there participates in something whether they want to or not. Because the route isn't just a road, it's a procedure. And after the first trip, you become the kind of driver that the procedure knows how to call. After that delivery, I tried to rationalize what had happened as a simple private corridor, a commercial agreement that didn't interest curious onlookers. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the trucks with their engines off on the shoulder, lined up as if someone had decided where each one should stop, so as not to disrupt the invisible flow of traffic. In the following days, I began to notice a pattern in the indirect accounts. They weren't complete stories nor clear warnings. They were loose phrases always interrupted, a comment deleted too quickly, a reply that disappeared before being read, people who changed the subject mid-sentence when someone mentioned detours or alternative routes. When I tried to speak with a former customs broker, someone I trusted, he listened in silence and simply told me to be careful about which route I chose to take. He didn't ask for details. He didn't want the name of the route. It was as if hearing it was enough to compromise me. The most disturbing thing wasn't the fear of punishment. It was the clarity that no one was being forced to remain silent. The system worked because silence was more effective than any threat. Anyone who tried to explain became irrelevant, disposable, someone who ended up on the side of the road in their own career. Over time, I accepted other freight jobs with similar instructions. Always the same neutral language, always the same indirect route recommendation. Never the same road, but always the same logic. Routes that didn't appear complete in the history, windows that fit into other people's delays, movements that only made sense when no one asked questions. That's when I understood the true scope of it. The route that nobody mentions twice isn't a fixed place. It's a method. A way of using ordinary drivers to fill gaps that can't officially exist. And those who learn this in practice quickly discover that silence isn't optional. It's part of the payment. Today, when I see an empty forum thread or a question deleted before receiving an answer, I recognize the sign. Someone has gone where they shouldn't have commented. Someone has crossed a path that doesn't end at the destination, but in a permanent change in behavior. There is no formal warning, no list, no direct threat. There's only the certainty that talking is pointless and moving on is safer. Because after the first time you understand that the road continues, but the conversation ends there.